Fine. Okay, and we're live. Welcome to the next installment of SciFund Voices. I'm Dr. Jai Ranganathan. I'm an ecologist, and I'm also executive director of SciFund Challenge, an organization that exists to close the gap between science and society. And SciFund Voices is a monthly online panel series where we talk about issues in science outreach and science crowdfunding, all sorts of things. So this month we've got a great panel where we're going to be talking about how to use social media as a scientist without blowing up your scientific career, at least how to advance your scientific career. And we've got a great set of people to talk about this. And let me first introduce Dr. Holly Bick, who is a biologist at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And she also is a blogger with Deep Sea News, a very highly trafficked marine science blog. So Holly, let's start with you. How has, I think a lot of scientists might be nervous, or maybe they're not nervous about social media, but how has social media helped you, or has it helped you in your scientific career?
Yeah, I think it's been fantastic for me. So I use it as a tool, specifically at conferences and things like that, when you're going and trying to network as a scientist. And I started using social media as an early career scientist, so essentially right after I finished my PhD. And I was trying to build up my reputation and meet people, and so I think it had a really positive impact on just networking in the research community and figuring out who was doing things similar to me, and then sort of keeping track of them afterwards. So I sort of use it for different purposes. I can talk about the outreach versus the research, but professionally it's been an extremely useful tool, and it really makes my life more efficient as a researcher.
And what tools do you use?
So I use Twitter on a daily basis. I mean, I have the app on my phone, and I sort of use it as a sort of efficient way to procrastinate, I guess you could say that. So, in between, taking a break from writing or analyzing data, I'll just go on Twitter. And so it's sort of beneficial to my career, but it's also a break. I use blogs, so I blog at Deep Sea News. I'm trying to blog more about research. I write guest posts for multiple blogs, but those are the two main tools that I use. Facebook is more personal, so but Twitter is really the powerhouse in my eyes.
Let me next introduce Dr. Karen James, who's a staff scientist at the Mount Desert Biological Laboratory. Did I get that right, Karen?
Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory.
So close, so close. And she also has an extensive presence on social media as well. So, Karen, how has social media helped your career, or has it?
Well, it definitely has helped my career. I think, and I said this on Twitter just a few minutes ago, actually, that you should check back with me in 20 years to find out whether it has, in fact, blown up my career in either the good way or the bad way. But like Holly said, conferences, networking, professional aspects like research and outreach, and in my specific case, there have been a couple of shining stars amongst those categories. One of them was in 2010, I was chosen to be a scientist guide to a group of high school students who had won a competition and were going to Galapagos. And so I got to go to Galapagos, which had been one of my dreams up to that point, both professional and personal. And a couple of years ago, I also got an opportunity to use a brand new, not yet on the market, DNA sequencer called the MinION, primarily through the fact that that Oxford Nanopore knew me and was interested in me because of my social media use. So it actually created a new project for me and gave me an opportunity I might not have had otherwise. And there's a bunch more examples. Maybe some of them will come out as we go along today.
Sure. Next, I'd like to bring to discussion Sarah Klain, who is an ecologist. I guess, would you call yourself an ecologist? We can talk about that. a scientist at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And now Sarah's got a really interesting story of what happens perhaps when social media goes wrong, like when animals attack. And Sarah, would you mind sort of relaying that story? Sarah, we cannot hear you. And while we are figuring...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can't hear you now.
I've got an idea here. So, Sarah, while we're working out your technical issues, Karen, let me go back and ask you a question, which is, you have 10,000 Twitter followers, which is a huge number. Have there been any minefields you've avoided to get to that? I mean, on that march to that giant number, have there been any minefields or pitfalls that you've had to avoid along the way?
It is a giant number. See, I look at Ed Yong and I think I have a ways to go. You were asking me, right? Not Holly?
Yes. Yeah, I was asking.
She has a lot of followers too. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure if I avoided any minefields, but I do know I benefited from maybe the opposite of a minefield, which is kind of accidental happenings that boosted my follower number. So, for example, very early on when I started Twitter in 2008, I started a London Science Tweetup, or hashtag London Sci Tweetup, which I think is still going, actually. And met a few people through that, and one of the people, Andrew Maynard at 2020 Science, wrote an article in Mashable, top 13 twits who will change your perspective on reality, and he included me, and suddenly I went from having hundreds of followers to over 1,000 followers. Then about a year later I was included on a list in the Independent. I was living in the UK at the time, so that's where my whole kind of social media / in real life network was developing. And so the Independent had a list of Twitter people on science and included me, and suddenly then my numbers went up again. And I've had stagnant periods, and then I've had big booms when things happen, and I think the take-home message is that I couldn't have planned any of them. I couldn't have set out and said, by 2014, I'm going to have 13,000 followers, and this is how I'm going to do it. I could, if some of those things didn't happen, I could very well have 5,000 followers right now. So, or maybe if other things had happened, I could have 20,000 right now. I think there isn't like a formula for getting followers.
Let me transition back to Sarah. Sarah, maybe my thought for you is that maybe you could, since you can only hear, it's sort of like a walkie-talkie with you can hear and listen, but now they're both at the same time. Maybe you can tell your story, and when you're done, you can sort of unplug so you can hear back again. How does that sound?
Okay. Can you hear me now, or is it still muted?
Go for it.
You can hear me now.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. So I had a very interesting. You want me to tell you my minor fiasco with social media?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. When I was doing research on marine ecosystem services as part of my master's research, I was looking at benefits that people got from the ocean in a place in northern Vancouver Island where salmon aquaculture is a very politically charged issue. The salmon aquaculture industry is really on the defensive, and they are pretty, they have been attacked by many scientists, so they're often on the defensive.
And what are let me interrupt you. What are the issues that they're defensive about?
So, from my perspective, the salmon aquaculture industry thinks that they are bringing jobs to a place that is hungry for jobs, and they provide year-round employment. They think that they're doing everything in their power to reduce environmental risks associated with having pens of Atlantic salmon in waters of the Pacific Ocean. A lot of the science that has been published in top journals has critiqued the influence of there's sea lice outbreaks in the farmed salmon that can jump onto juvenile wild salmon, and scientists have shown that it reduces their resilience to other stressors in the environment. So a lot of environmentalists have come out very opposed to, environmentalists and scientists have come out very opposed to salmon aquaculture in net pens in the ocean. That was not the focus of my research, but I went into this setting and I contacted a wide variety of people, including some of the PR representatives at the aquaculture industry, asking if they would participate in my research and conduct an interview, or if I could interview them, basically. And they Googled my name after they got the invitation, and I think one of the first things that must have come up when they Googled my name was a tweet that I had made. And this is about 5-6 years ago, when I was very new to tweeting, and I didn't realize how high a tweet could come up when you simply Google anybody's name. So I had made a tweet with, I think it was scientists, salmon, activism, and then a link to a rally in Victoria, the capital of British Columbia. It was a rally for wild salmon. And based on this tweet, as well as an article for a small little local urban newspaper that my advisor Kai Chan and I wrote. We had written a little article about how the aquaculture industry ought to consider moving their operations onto land because of the environmental risks associated with doing their operations in the ocean. So based on this article for a public audience, plus my tweet, the aquaculture industry reps, they didn't even contact me. They went straight to our local government project partners and told them that these government project partners, they should dissolve any relationship they have with my advisor and I, and that we are biased scientists and shouldn't be doing our work in that place. And it was really uncomfortable for me as a master's student, because I had only pointed to an event that was a rally for wild salmon, and my research wasn't even focused on salmon aquaculture. It was far more broadly based on marine ecosystem services. So that tweet and the little article that my advisor and I had written, it made for a few days of fraught conversations with our local government partners. In the end, my advisor was able to defend our work, defend our science, defend that article about moving salmon aquaculture onto land, and the government partners did not dissolve our research partnership, but it was really stressful. I don't regret the tweet that I had made, but it was a reminder of how powerful Twitter can be when you're trying to build relationships with new industry people and industry who already feels very threatened by the work of environmental scientists. So I don't regret what I did, but it was eye-opening.
So Sarah, one thing I find interesting about your story is that in one sense it's the worst case scenario that some I know is you send one wrong tweet and it could have major impacts for your career, but in fact that you did send the quote-unquote one wrong tweet, but it turned out to be fine in the end. Or was it fine in the end?
I don't aspire to work in the salmon aquaculture industry, so if I had career ambitions for working in that industry, then perhaps it would have been more detrimental, but my take on the scientific literature is that there are substantial environmental risks associated with salmon aquaculture. So based on my reading of the scientific literature, that was what informed my tweet and informed that article in the newspaper that I had written. And I think in the end, things were patched up, but it certainly felt like a little minor fire that could have it could have undone the years of relationship building that the NGO partner of mine, Living Ocean Society, had built up with the local government there. So in the end, didn't damage my research. People were able to patch things over. I guess I went in a bit naive, though, about the ripple effects from a tweet.
So do you approach social media differently now after that experience?
No, I continue to post links to causes that I believe in, and I think I go into it with a little bit more self-awareness, and I make it a point to be mindful about my tweets and to really reflect on who could be reading them, how this might impact somebody who randomly Google searches my name. I just approach, I think a lot of people do Twitter in a very knee-jerk reaction, and I try to engage what psychologists call my System 2 thinking. So System 1 is like immediate, based on instinct, emotional reaction, and then System 2 is the more rational, deliberate, more time-consuming, more energy-intensive thinking. I try to tap into that System 2 thinking when I tweet now, not just relying on immediate gut reactions.
Can I just chime in on that and say, you know, there's certain things in academia too which you just don't tweet about. So if you're going to review proposals on a panel, or you're doing anything that requires confidentiality, I mean, it's sort of maybe less severe, but there could be potential career repercussions. So it's definitely worthwhile to sort of evaluate social media use in the context of your current and maybe planned future career trajectory, and you know, make decisions based on that.
I would add, though, that requires you to the ability to sort of predict what may or may not happen and what may or may not be controversial. And I sort of go along thinking I will probably at some point, regardless of everything I would do to try and be mindful about all of those things, I will probably, in fact I have, said or tweeted something wrong, something that I regret. I once misquoted Martin Rees, and Nature News tweeted kind of angrily at me, and I had to retract, and that was embarrassing. But it could have been worse, you know. Could always be worse.
So on that,
my point is to just be cautious about if I avoid talking about this, and this, I'll be okay.
But there's also certain baseline rules, like just don't post junk pictures anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
On
but you know, there's sort of a tension here, which is that, you know, I think as scientists we're used to writing scientific papers where everything is revised and revised and revised, and the product that people only see at the end is something that's been thought through a million times over. So that's on one hand. But on the other hand, if you think about every tweet 1,000 times to get a peer reviewed, you're never going to do it. So how do you balance that?
So I guess I'll take that first. I think that one of the reasons that people like my tweets, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but maybe why I have as many followers as I do, one of the reasons is because I'm willing to take a little bit of a risk with my tweeting and say things I believe in and say things that I care about, say things that would be considered off topic in terms of my scientific career, way off topic, probably. And so that can be a good thing, and I think if I just avoided all of that, it would be boring, and then like you said, what would be the point? What would you tweet about?
So Holly, last year in 2014, you published a paper in PLOS Biology about MicrobeNet. Maybe can you talk a bit about what MicrobeNet is and what people interested in online communication might learn about that, what they might have to learn from that?
Yeah, sure. So MicrobeNet is a project spearheaded by Jonathan Eisen at UC Davis, who was my former postdoc advisor. And it's essentially an experiment in how to build a community, a scientific community, where none previously existed. So the Sloan Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, they have this research program right now called Microbiology, the Built Environment. So it's basically trying to look at how microbes in buildings and any sort of human-built structures actually have effects on public health and, and how building design can affect microbes. So it's sort of this interdisciplinary network, or it's hopefully going to be this, well, it is now, this network of microbiologists and building scientists and architects and all these different disciplines trying to come together around a central question. So the MicroNet project was funded as a specific, essentially a social media grant, so to build this portal website and do a lot of blogging and tweeting and organizing conferences, things like that, to be essentially the way to catalyze this research field. So I was working on that a lot at UC Davis, coming up with new ways to communicate scholarly information. So we're dealing with a project called Press Forward, which is one way to pull, it's essentially scraping RSS feeds from the web and publishing that on a blog site. So it's kind of, it's this mix between traditional scientific outlets and new ways of disseminating information.
And so, in this, so what have you learned are sort of the best practices? What works and what doesn't work for scientists in this space?
Yeah, so I guess going back to the PLOS biology paper, we published a sort of a perspective piece looking back and saying, what worked for us, what didn't work, and some of the things that didn't work. I mean, so it's interesting because it sort of outlines the differences between disciplines too, because microbial ecologists like me that are on, I don't know, I'm on the computer all the time, so I've adopted Twitter a lot quicker than, say, someone who's maybe in the building science community. So there's differences between scientific disciplines and on average, how much people adopt social media and sort of view that as a useful tool. So there's sort of historical factors in play. And strangely enough, the more we use social media, the more it sort of underlines the need for in-person interactions, because you sort of spend all this time online, and there's people I talk to all the time on Twitter, but I've never actually met in person. So when you meet people in person, it's just a totally different type of interaction, and that's a really important interaction for establishing a connection and sort of maintaining that network in the long term. And then there's a lot of unknowns still. I mean, it's still an experiment. Social media hasn't been around for that long, so we're still really trying to gather statistics and metrics to figure out what works and what doesn't, because things like website views, it's sort of you can collect those numbers, but at the end of the day, sometimes we're not really sure how to use those or how that actually signifies impact.
So I'd like to talk a bit about and get your thoughts about how you actually use Twitter in the sense or social media in general. I think it's been a very Twitter-focused discussion, but it doesn't have to be. In the sense that you use it mostly for getting the word out about, essentially getting the word out about things that you care about, or is it as more of a tool for two-way communication, or how do you end up using it the most?
It sort of varies over time too. Right now I'm in the midst of crazy grant writing season, so I just apart from advertising the panel and sort of doing some things, maybe once or twice a day, I'm not actually actively using it. So, and when I'm at conferences, I'm using it in a different way than I would be when I'm at a just back in the lab at home. How do I use it? I do think about it. I mean, I try to plan out, how do I want to come across on Twitter. So my long-term goals, so I'm an advocate of dispelling stereotypes about scientists. So I probably emphasize sometimes things that are, things like fashion and art and design, which are my personal interests, and I wouldn't necessarily advertise those and sort of let people into my personality in that way unless it was sort of going hand in hand with my long-term outreach goals. I also use it so I'm in a field, I use genomics, and our field is very cutting edge, so most of the working knowledge in our field is not actually published. So if I have a question about software or some sort of tool or programming language that I need to know, I'll actually find it easier to go to the Twitter community and ask them rather than trying to trawl through published papers, because essentially the published literature can be out of date sometimes. So it's sort of real-time knowledge. So I guess that's two examples spanning research and outreach. And I do a lot of different things, but I think that's a good summary.
What about you, Karen and Sarah? Is that similar to your patterns?
I use Twitter mainly for research, and I use it mostly as a way to signpost to things that my lab group is involved with. So there's several people in my lab group, and we try to amplify each other's publications and blog postings through Twitter. So that's the vast majority of the way that I use it. It's just to point other people to a lot of the work that my lab group does.
Am I next? I'm the last one, right?
Yeah.
As for me, I guess I use it for those reasons. I would like to be more mindful of kind of the proportion of tweets that I send in different categories, like personal, work-related, and within work-related outreach versus science, though those things really shouldn't have a versus between them. Anyways, that would be great, but I don't. I wish I could sit here and tell you a third of my tweets are pictures of my skiing, and a third of them are, links to something I think about a paper, and a third are explainers on the topic that I work on or something. But really, I don't. I know that there are other people who try to be mindful about that, and I am inspired by them. And I probably should. On the other hand, I find I need to want to enjoy Twitter if I'm going to use it. And so if I were too prescriptive with myself, I would probably start to feel constrained, and then I wouldn't want to use it so much. So I think there might be a balance between those things. I do use it a lot in terms of in the professional category, which is I think what we're talking about today mostly. I use it to get solidarity with other researchers, to get advice. Like I get advice all the time from people who are further along in their careers than I am and might have tips and tricks on how to be successful with NSF grant proposals, or I use it to get ideas and to spark new collaborations. At conferences, it's incredible, of course, but I can't understate the role of Twitter as moral support for me, and just the community that I have there. It feels like I'm at a conference with all the best people 24 hours a day that I can dip into whenever I want.
So, for a question for all three of you, do you find that you're mostly on Twitter? I mean, what about on the science end of things? What about Facebook or Pinterest or Instagram or Tumblr? That there are millions of places. What do you end up using?
I kind of differentiate personal stuff from professional stuff. So for me, Facebook is 90% personal, 10% professional, and then Twitter for me is like the opposite, 90% professional, 10% personal. So I guess it's just because I still keep those communities kind of segregated. Like there is a lot of overlap, but like I don't know. I'm just not comfortable with my merging the two all the time in every social media milieu. So that's I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned.
But it sounds like for you, Sarah, the two that you use, period, would be Twitter and Facebook, more the end. Would that be correct?
I admit to really liking Instagram, too, but that's just for fun, to look at pretty pictures and National Geographic photographers and my friends who take awesome photos. So Instagram for me is just pure fun, and Twitter's mostly work, and Facebook is mostly fun.
Karen and Holly, what do you think?
So Twitter, it's a lot more mixed up than what Sarah was describing for me, except that with Facebook, I have some pretty strict sort of self-rules to keep it mostly friends. One of those is I won't friend someone on Facebook that I haven't actually met in person and I don't actually consider a friend or at least an acquaintance that I want to get to know better or something. And I also, if I post something, that way if I post something personal and I just post it to friends, I know that no one that I work with will see it. And it's not like I'm posting big rants all the time. No, just kidding. But if I did, and if I needed a support network, a personal support network, I would want to have that space that was firewalled from my, not professional. There are a lot of people I know professionally who I'm friends with on Facebook, but definitely at least my colleagues and people I work with, people I supervise, people I have supervised in the past. I tell them to get in touch with me on Twitter.
Holly.
Yeah, so I have so many social media accounts. I have Instagram, I have Tumblr, I have Pinterest, I have Facebook, I have Twitter, I didn't join Elo, I couldn't deal with another one. That's not to say I use them all the time. I sort of used to use Tumblr, but it's kind of fallen off the radar. I just got social media fatigue. I mean, I can't physically manage all those accounts, and there's great things like TweetDeck for Twitter to help you manage Twitter, because Twitter itself can require a lot of management, especially with different hashtags if you're trying to follow those conversations. And that being said, I do use Instagram a lot for taking pictures, and I have it linked to Facebook and Twitter. So if I want to push all those posts to the different networks, then I do make use of that, and that goes for the blogs too. I mean, we basically auto-post all the blog posts to social media. So there's a lot of apps, and if IFFT as well as another app, so you can basically set up customized workflows to link all your social media things. And one thing we had highlighted in our, so Miriam Goldstein and I have a 2013 paper in PLOS Biology that touches on some of the demographics of the different social media networks. So, one thing we talked about is that if you have an outreach plan, it actually is beneficial to use different social media networks because different people have different just different interests. So Pinterest, for example, is something like 80% female, and the demographics vary across networks. So if you do have an outreach plan, you might be spreading yourself a little thin, but it's an important thing to consider as part of that plan. So we do take that into account, especially for things like Deep Sea News, which are more geared towards disseminating the content, versus if I'm just doing it for my own personal sake. I'll just stick with something like Twitter if I'm trying to interact within the scientific community.
I feel like Sarah's experience, and because I feel this in myself, is that of keeping Twitter as a more or less professional space. That's kind of how I use it as well, and I feel like that's maybe the most predominant way that scientists end up using Twitter versus Facebook. I know in other communities, other groups, Facebook is both a professional and personal space. But it seems not to work that way for scientists. Is that your impression as well?
I'm not sure I agree with that. Let's not forget about the pseudonymous tweeters who are doing that. Hey, pseudonymous tweeters, I love you. They're doing that for a whole bunch of different reasons. There's probably a reason for every person that writes under a pseudonym. But that's one of the, if you're keeping things professional on Twitter, and that means that you aren't getting personal on Twitter, that might be for a reason. You perceive there might be a conflict between personal and professional, or potential conflict, or you're worried. So you might create a pseudonym to talk about all the other stuff. But of course the lines are blurred, and so scientists or people in the realm of science who tweet or post on social media under a pseudonym also talk about science. So I think there probably are a lot of people who aren't keeping it professional on Twitter, but a lot of those people, I'm not saying more, I'm not saying less, but a lot of those people are tweeting under pseudonyms.
What do you guys think?
I want a citation, Jai.
A citation for what?
For your assertion just now that most scientists are keeping it professional on Twitter.
Ranganathan Purse Com. How about that? So what's your feelings or how to use something that erupts all the time are these Twitter quote-unquote debates, and it sort of came to mind because one thing I'm going to read a section from Holly's paper in PLOS Biology about the microbe net that came out last year, and here's the relevant section. Another lesson relates to social media. By allowing anyone to participate in online discussions, we found there is a risk of entrapment by special interests. For example, the microbe LinkedIn group initially hosted some productive scientific discussions, but it is now being overloaded with announcements and self-promotional material from one particular building science society. Have you noticed that? And so I'd like to bring in that idea of this question of Twitter discussions or Twitter debates. Do you find them useful? If so, when?
I'll just chime in too, and I think that these debates vary depending on the platform. So something like LinkedIn is obviously a very different format from Twitter. And the Twitter debates, because you're limited to 140 characters, they seem to escalate very quickly. I don't know, I sort of view it like Black Friday. Just don't try to get involved, stay home, do online shopping. You know, and I think a lot of the Twitter debates stem from people not knowing when to or I don't know what they stem from, but it's just not the right medium for having certain discussions. But people try to have those discussions anyway, and inevitably, you know, hurt feelings are hurt, or something gets misconstrued, and then those debates kind of rage up. So yeah, if you're trying to say something more thought-provoking, or you need more than 140 characters. The best thing to do would be to go to something like a blog or a Facebook post, so that you can say what you want to say and be tactful about it and not have that potential of being misconstrued.
What are you saying, Holly?
I don't know. Are you talking about a specific Twitter debate?
I don't know. I get into them a lot.
So what's your view on them, Karen, since you do?
I've never actually been in them. I don't know if it's because people just don't care about what I say, or if it's just maybe some subject matter is more. Obviously, there's controversial topics, right, where climate change, anything like that, where you're more likely to get trolled. So I really don't know what sparks them a lot of times, but fortunately, I really haven't been involved in them to date.
Most of the Twitter debates I'm involved in. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Some of the Twitter debates I'm involved in are around feminism and women in science. And so, for example, Shirtgate or Shirtstorm. And there are many other examples, but if we just use that one, you know, I said what I thought about the shirt.
Can you back up a bit?
For anyone who's watching who doesn't know what I'm talking about.
Karen, what is Shirtstorm?
Shirtstorm. Oh, wait, have you just given me a public platform to talk about Shirtstorm?
In brief.
Shirtstorm, European Space Agency scientists wore a shirt with lots of scantily clad women on it during the ESA Rosetta comet landing that had millions of people watching, and some people, including me, complained about the shirt because it's sexist and didn't seem welcoming to women in science or girls, and it just exploded, and a bunch of Gamergate people came over and toxified the conversation even more, and in the end, well, no, I shouldn't say in the end, because actually it's still going in some little corners, but there were death and rape threats from some people defending the shirt against against women who had complained about the shirt, and it got that bad, and there was doxing, and it was horrible. So maybe that's all I'll say about Shirtgate, except to say that it is one of the debates I've participated in, and it's funny because my follower numbers tend to go up when those things happen. That's not why I do it. In fact, probably a lot of them unfollow me later when I stop talking about that. But I think I do it because I really care about this conversation that we're having in public and the implications of it. And I really care about the kind of plight of women in science in particular, and I also really care about diversity in science. And so I am passionate about those topics, and so I am going to talk to people about them.
But how do you do that? I mean, just physically, because you think of, so on Twitter you have 140 characters, but you don't really have 140 characters because you put a couple names in there, and inevitably as the discussion goes on, more and more names get added to less and less for your content. So particularly if you're talking about very, what's the word, sensitive topics, shall we say, like sort of women in science, racism, that sort of thing. How do you manage to say what you mean to say in a very short amount of space? That seems to be a real hurdle.
Two answers to that. One is practice. If I start writing a tweet and I go over 140 characters, I have learned how to get concise without losing, I think I do an okay job at it, without losing my message. I sometimes don't get it right, but it's amazing what you can do with language. And sure, you can shorten things and that helps and everything, but you can actually say a lot in 140 characters if you practice. And then the other thing is, if you need to do something longer, you could write a blog post about it, like Holly was noting, and I do still do that a little bit. You can write a Facebook post and link to it. You can use tweet longer. Some people use that. I don't use that. You can do a multi-part tweet series, and as long as you reply to the very last tweet in the series, when people click on your first or last tweet, they'll see the whole thing on their screen, and they can kind of follow the whole conversation that way. There have been some really amazing tweet series in the last I don't know, year or two that I've bookmarked the whole series because it's so good, and I've shared it and told people they should go read it. And all you need to do is share the link to the first or last tweet in it, and everyone else will be able to see it. So there are ways of extending it, and as long as you mark your tweets as part of a series, I think that you can get away with it. If you just start spamming people, though, with lots and lots of tweets that are unwelcome, they're not going to like that very much. So you have to kind of learn the culture of Twitter so that you don't get annoying. I'm sure I'm annoying to a lot of people, but...
So just to push back, not to push back, to ask, I mean, how is it that, what allows you to sort of engage in these debates which are sort of, I guess, what are culturally sensitive? Because I imagine you must, when you were replying to this question of sexism in science, in the Shirtgate thing, there must have been, I imagine there was a strong pushback from certain parts, which was addressed partially to you. And I know for me personally, if someone I don't know says you're terrible, or you're the worst, or something worse, I personally have real trouble with that. You know, that personally affects me. But how do you manage to have it not affect you, or does it not, or does it affect you, but you just don't mind it?
Right. It's something worse, like you said.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's probably a combination of how thick your own personal skin is, and how much you have energy for debate. Sometimes I don't, and I just have to I have to say, ooh, they're talking about that today. Oh, well, I'm writing a grant proposal and the deadline's coming up, and I just can't. And I do that a lot too. But in terms of taking, I mean, it can affect me in some ways. I feel like I'm deflecting it from other people if I'm taking it, maybe. But you know, I've had people call me names and everything. I gotta tell you though, that's just kind of being a woman on the internet. I mean, I get it. I could choose not to be on the internet if I didn't like it, but I don't think avoiding debates, I don't know, maybe Holly or Sarah, you can tell me that I'm wrong, but you get these kinds of comments from people occasionally, and it's not nice, and I don't think that avoiding debates is going to ensure that you don't get those.
So I'd like to, Sarah and Holly, I'd like to hear what you think about this, because this does get into the question of Are there special considerations for women in all of this, particularly at a time when the question of women in science is such a topic that everybody's talking about, or many people are talking about, the way they weren't before? What do you think?
I'm really glad that people like you, Karen, do engage in these online debates. I'll be honest, I don't have the patience for getting involved with Twitter debates. Like, it's just not it's not a priority for me, but I'm really glad there's people like you that do invest time and effort into those kind of debates.
Thank you.
And on the topic of women in science, this might be shallow, but I think it's really awesome that there is a movie like Interstellar that just came out recently. Like, despite the fact that the last 15 minutes, just like the science lost me, but the fact that there's an engineer and a female astronaut scientist, and that was just taken, that they were female and they were super competent, and they didn't ignore the role that emotion played in their life, but they were very competent scientists. I feel like our culture needs more females in movies and culturally significant things to show that, you know, there's awesome women out there who are great scientists, and they can still be quite female and still be excellent scientists. And I think it's really important that more women participate in these online discussions and debates. I know I, for one, rarely have the energy or appetite to engage like that. I think part of that is because of the anonymity. The internet's amazing, but I'm still, like, if I'm going to have an argument with somebody, I don't want it to be with somebody who's anonymous. Like, and I'd rather have the discussion offline where you can pick up on social cues a little. I feel like the internet's bad for expressing emotion and subtlety in emotion, and when you're having a disagreement, you can, I don't know, to some extent take things away that they weren't necessarily intended because you're not getting the in-person delivery of it. So, Karen, I'm glad you get involved in debates like that. I probably won't do that much, but if I feel really strongly about something, I will.
So that brings up a topic that I think about, which is that, you know, I don't frequently engage these sorts of debates, but occasionally I do, and often there's a pushback, but the pushback, and often a strong pushback, but I find for me personally, there's never ever a personal attack. I mean, people might say my ideas are terrible from the start, but they never say I'm terrible. And I'm getting the sense that if you're a woman on social media, that's not necessarily the case.
Right. I don't think anything more needs to be said about that, Jai. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, we don't need to have this conversation turn into this has been dissected and analyzed a lot lately, and it's important, and I think there are a lot of reasons, and I think it's a real problem, and it has escalated in a couple of cases to threats to people's persons and livelihoods, and so yeah, I don't know. It's just something that's the way it is right now, and you know, a lot of people are not willing to accept that level of risk or abuse or harassment, and so they don't engage probably. I mean, there's probably a million voices out there that we're not hearing because of this issue.
Holly, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm to be honest, I'm so disorganized and so busy sometimes that by the time I see these debates, it's about 3 days later, and everyone's said everything so much better than I could have said it. So I don't tend to engage more for those reasons sometimes, but I do watch from the sidelines, and I guess my strategy is more directing the effort towards sort of academia and in my career. So, you know, when I'm organizing conferences, thinking about gender balance, and you know, I'm committed to academia because I realize that there are many less women in academia, and you know, I'm in a computational biology, so that's a field where it does tend to be a lot more male dominated than some other fields. So you know, the debates are useful because for me it sort of makes me think about what's going on, and people have these conversations in the online sphere, and that does help inform my own actions and how I sort of proceed forward in my career and interact with others.
There's something I wanted to add. My outspokenness about women in science on Twitter has actually led to new directions in my professional career. For example, one of my aims in my recent grant proposal included outreach related to women in science and girls in science, and part of that was born out of my engaging on this topic on Twitter. So I don't see this as kind of a separate thing, at least for me, really. Like, the only time I was ever mentioned in the New Yorker was about a conversation I was having about women in science on Twitter. So it does cross over. It can cross over back into your career in ways that are potentially good and beneficial to your career if that's a direction you want to go in. So I just wanted to get that in there.
Yeah, I would say that that's true about pretty much anything, even if it's research-wise. I mean, I was doing a lot of blogging in 2010 after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and all of a sudden I was sort of an expert on that. And I'm not an expert. I've never done oil. Now I do oil spill work, so I guess I've become an expert. But the conversations you have in the online sphere, whether they're on women in science or whether they're on different research topics, I think it can definitely open up new horizons, and people get in touch with you, or media contacts will sort of reach out to you for stories and things like that. So it's you never know what's going to happen. So that's kind of what makes it fun.
So Holly, I'd like to sort of transition a bit to talk about those sort of the positive side. So you spend a lot of time in this conversation talking about what happens when things go wrong, or how do we manage that. But maybe can you give it? You sort of given some of them already, but can you think of a specific anecdote or example of how your heavy use of the online space has really helped you? And you've also mentioned, so can you give one can you talk about one in detail?
Yeah. So I guess it helps me figure out who's doing what research-wise. So a lot of time I'm really interdisciplinary too. So I have trouble keeping track of 10 different fields because I'm just not. I'm spread too thin. So a lot of times Twitter is really useful in figuring out. This person has this lab and they're focusing on this research topic, and I'll discover that through Twitter because someone's retweeted something or I'm mentioned in a tweet with someone, and I'll go investigate further and realize that there's a lot of good papers that this lab is producing. It relates directly to my research. There's been instances where I've reached out to people that I've found out about through Twitter, and that's sort of led to if not recurrent, a lot of times it's recurrent contacts or meeting in person if I'm in the area, but it's kind of a, we've gotten papers on it too, so it does lead to research outputs, and it sort of broadens your network and does lead to potentially things like grant funding down the line.
Sarah and Karen, do you have some specific anecdotes of how the use of the space has really helped you?
Besides my ion DNA sequencer, Galapagos trip.
One second, please. Okay, go ahead. I just hit to mute Sarah there. Karen, can you repeat that?
You mean besides my ion DNA sequencer and my Galapagos trip and things like that?
And mentioned in the New Yorker.
Yeah, that too.
That's all pretty good.
Okay, and I was on that science list of top Twitter stars or whatever, that very problematic science list of top Twitter stars. A lot of things have happened that have been good in small and large ways, and they probably add up to a transformational effect on my career. And I think I'm probably in a place where I am now that I wouldn't be without social media. I feel like I can say that with certainty. If you're asking for like specific anecdotes,
well, that's a good one right there. You don't need.
Yeah, I don't. There's so many. the individual connections and the collaborations that grow out of that can be amazing. And I have too many of those really to count. And the final thing is, I would say that if it gets you, in terms of you're just developing your reputation amongst a larger group of people, especially if you're a junior scientist like a PhD student or a postdoc, or in my case, an early career faculty member, it can help you have a community and a voice that might be bigger than what you would have if you were kind of cloistered. And so I think that's, it's automatically expanding your network, and that is going to help you.
Fantastic. Sarah, you can unmute yourself.
I have smaller indicators. Can you hear me?
We're going to have to mute you since there's something wrong with your microphone. So I think we're near, sorry about that, Sarah. Your computer is not cooperating, but we are nearing end of time. Are there any final thoughts or things we haven't covered or things you'd like to mention that we haven't gotten to yet?
I would just say, find what works for you. There's no system. Everyone uses social media differently. So if something we said doesn't jive with how you want to use it, then that's perfectly fine.
I agree totally with what Holly just said. Let 1,000 flowers bloom, and we're all making this up as we go along. We are doing a big experiment on ourselves, and that requires accepting a certain amount of risk, and it depends, the amount of risk depends on what sorts of things you talk about on Twitter or other social media. And not everyone has the privilege of accepting as much risk as other people. So it's important to bear that in mind too. Some people can take more risks than other people because they're in a place in their life, or they have certain advantages that allows them to do that. But that was the only other thing I just wanted to get in there before the end of this conversation. But yeah, there's a million ways to do it right, I think is the short version.
Okay, with that, we're come to the end of our time.
Sorry, Sarah.
Yes, I apologize, Sarah. So I'd like to thank Dr. Let's start that again. I'd like to thank Dr. Holly Bick, Dr. Karen James, and Sarah Klain for being on the panel. This SciFund Voices is a monthly series, so we'll be doing another one next month. If you'd like to learn about it, join our email list, which you can find at scifundchallenge.org. You can also follow us at SciFund, which is SCIFUND, on Twitter. Thanks again to our panelists and to the viewers for watching, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks.
Yeah.